Thank you, Phil, and everyone who has made this event possible. I'm really happy to be able to share with you about my pilgrimage experience. I've titled this presentation, Tales from a Walking Pilgrimage, My Transformative Time on the Cornish Celtic Way. And my goal today is to share with you a glimpse of the pilgrimage experience I enjoyed last summer and some reflections on the meaningfulness of that time for me as a person of faith. So here's the way that I've structured the presentation. I'm going to start by telling you a bit about myself and my interest in pilgrimage. Then I'll give you an overview of the Cornish Celtic Way, which is a pilgrimage I walked. I'll turn to the more reflective section of the talk, introduce a thesis about the transformative power of pilgrimage, and give you examples of that thesis in practice. And finally, I'll end with some thoughts about inspiring the young to walk. Okay, so who am I and how did I get interested in pilgrimage? Well, there I am in my pilgrimage gear last year. For the purposes of this talk, all you really need to know is I'm a cradle Catholic. I've been practicing my whole life. I'm currently a PhD student in philosophy at a school in Texas called Baylor University. And my interest in pilgrimage came from two separate angles in my life that both coalesced at the same point. So in 2021, I was finishing up a degree in theology, and I was working on a translation of a medieval liturgical rite called the Blessing for Pilgrims Before Their Departure. And actually, the particular rites I was translating came from two British cathedrals. And in the course of making these translations, I fell in love with the ways that the medieval church thought about pilgrimage. So here on the right, you see this image of a bishop performing this rite, and he's blessing the pilgrim satchels and walking sticks. So as an example of the kind of theological insight I fell in love with, this liturgy speaks about the pilgrim satchel as an armor of humility hung around his neck, and also as an instantiation of Christ's gentle and light yoke. And the pilgrim's walking stick was more than just a practical aid. It was a kind of weapon for staving off the devil. And I was really taken by these sacramental ways of thinking about traveling and the power of traveling for the soul. So around the same time, my dad and three of his friends were preparing to walk their first pilgrimage, and they walked the Pilgrim's Way from Winchester to Canterbury in the summer of 2022. So I got to witness firsthand the preparation that went into walking a pilgrimage, from route calculations to gear assessment and spiritual and historical reading. And through being connected closely to my dad's experience, I realized that all of the fascinating elements of pilgrimage that I was learning about at university, they didn't just exist in the past. Pilgrimage is an activity of Christian life that can be accessed today, especially, I think, in a place like the UK, which has such well-marked and well-maintained paths. So that's just very briefly how I caught the pilgrimage bug. And it wasn't just me that caught the bug. It was several people in my family. So there on the left is my husband, Armand, who's showing off some blackberries he found on the trail. In the middle is my dad, Franz, climbing over one of these gates on the path that we came across all the time. And there on the right is my brother, Nick, and I. And this is the whole crew that together decided to walk the Cornish Celtic Way last year. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about the Cornish Celtic Way itself. This is a pilgrimage route put together by Reverend Nigel Marnes, an Anglican rector who lives in Cornwall, and he's done just a wonderful job of developing a guidebook and passport for this route. And it starts in St. Germans, where there is a priory church, a very important priory church dating to the 12th century. That was once a cathedral in Cornwall. And then from St. Germans, the route walks along the southern coast, crosses the peninsula, continues along the northern coast, and finally comes back down to end at St. Michael's Mount, where, of course, There is a fantastic tidal island, home at one point to a Benedictine monastery, and a traditional pilgrim's destination associated with St. Michael. And the route, it actually connects two older pilgrim paths, one called the Saints' Way, which is the stretch across the peninsula, and St. Michael's Way at the end. The main stopping points along the route are Cornish churches, many of which are dedicated to local Cornish saints. And these are saints I had never heard of before, Piran and Petroc, Morwenna, Ia, and Keen. And many of these Cornish saints are thought to be early evangelists who sailed over from Ireland and Wales. And as they crossed the Cornish Peninsula, they started Christian communities. So walking from church to church, bearing the names of these saints, we followed in these saints' footsteps. And the central focus of our pilgrimage was learning about, following, and venerating these saints. I felt very close to them on the pilgrimage. They were our patrons. We prayed to them and visited their churches, even slept in some of their churches overnight. So my family, we mostly followed this route laid out by Nigel Marnes, but we did make our own additions. Out of necessity, we often detoured to cities in order to attend Sunday Mass. We also made some other excursions aligned with our spiritual goals. We made a point to visit holy wells, Celtic and Norman crosses, Roman Catholic churches, and in one case, a Carmelite convent. In terms of the nitty-gritty of life on the trail, the pilgrimage took us a little over 2 weeks, and we walked anywhere from 6 to 18 miles a day, carrying our belongings on our backs. The total mileage for the pilgrimage was 157 miles. And each day consisted of 3 modes of activity: walking, admiring, and worshiping or venerating. So there was like a regulating rhythm to every day. We would spend hours walking across terrain, interrupted by stops to admire the scenery or to visit a church, where we would learn about local history, admire the church's art and architecture, and venerate the saint honored by the church. And our custom on this pilgrimage was to pray the Divine Mercy Chaplet at each church altar. Okay, so I'm an academic and I can't get away from giving a thesis. So I want to turn now to the reflection on the transformative power of pilgrimage and offer this thesis to you, that pilgrimage is an antidote to many of our society's hedonistic temptations and alienating forces. This statement is a lived out discovery that I made as a result of walking my pilgrimage. So I want to take you through several of the concrete ways that pilgrimage functioned as an antidote for me. And I'm going to do that by reflecting on 3 salient aspects of my pilgrimage experience: walking, beauty, and tradition. Okay. First, I would like to talk about walking as an antidote to pride. My central claim here in this section is that walking on a pilgrimage instills humility and other virtues of dependence in the pilgrim. So just starting from the simple fact that the main daily action of a pilgrim is walking. We walked many different paths, up and down crazy elevations, through cornfields, along beaches, through forests, on country roads, and on cliffs. And these different paths came with their own unique hazards. So here are some of the hazards that really I fondly remember now. On the right, you have this thorny plant that used to just scratch up my legs all the time. In the middle, I love this photo. It's the sign for the Saints' Way, but then also the indication of 20% grade. Difficult climbing these elevations. And then on the left there, these gates we had to cross all the time. And of course, sometimes there was a bull in the field. So it became apparent to me very quickly on the pilgrimage that this kind of walking is categorically different from the walking I normally do, right? With the 20 pounds on my back and the long hours and these hazards to face, There's no other way to say it. This kind of walking was difficult. But here's the thing, I'm incredibly grateful for the challenge of walking on the pilgrimage. In my daily life, I can very easily fall under the illusion that I am self-sufficient, capable, and powerful all on my own. And this is the illusion of pride. And this illusion melts away rapidly on the trail. Walking, one of the easiest and most natural things I typically do, becomes difficult. Through this experience, I rediscovered something that I'm calling the lost art of falling down. What I mean is the art of falling down is the skill of recognizing that I'm a limited creature, that I'm subject to pain and tiredness, and yes, I do fall down. And I think just another way to describe this is as a rediscovery of humility. But, because of the communal and the spiritual support structures of pilgrimage, this lived humility, it does not lead to humiliation. Rather, it leads to a deeper acknowledgement that I depend on others for help and they depend on me. Right? So I depended on my fellow pilgrim all the time for aid, to cross a precarious bridge, or not to stumble over my own feet, or to take on an extra weight from my pack. And I did the same for my fellow pilgrim. Humility, asking for help, giving and receiving encouragement graciously, maintaining hope and good humor, these are some of the virtues of dependence that pilgrimage instilled in me. And sort of as a final point here, I think that the source of these virtues for me was always fundamentally Christ. So as much as my fellow pilgrim could encourage me and lighten my load, the inner strength to continue walking was given to me through prayer. And I experienced the truth of this in moments on the trail that were just so difficult that the only thing possible to do was to turn inward and turn to God. So I want to describe for you one moment I experienced this. It was walking through the St. Briac Downs, which is this continuous set of rolling hills. And our path this day seemed to stretch on forever. It took us through open farmland where the grass was high and wet and provided resistance to our boots. So it felt like we were moving in slow motion. And to add to that, there was this constant forceful crosswind that just kept blowing and threatening to push us off course. And in the hours of enduring this, all I could really do was pray. So I have this memory of just repeating to myself the Jesus prayer over and over again. And at the end of this walk, here's sort of the payoff of this. My dad and I, we looked at each other and we started to laugh. And we laughed about how hard those hours had been and how unlucky we'd been with the weather. And thinking back on that now, like that holy laughter we experienced, that was definitely the work of the Holy Spirit, giving us not only the strength to persevere, but also this joy at the end. So to sum up what I've been saying so far, walking on pilgrimage, insofar as it challenged me to rely on others and on God, was an antidote to pride and its pitfalls. Next, I want to talk about beauty as an antidote to self-obsession and insensitivity. My central claim here is that pilgrimage reorients you to true beauty. The first way it does this is by getting you out of yourself and out of focusing on the beauty in yourself, right? So walking on pilgrimage is a very self-effacing activity. You're not often thinking about yourself. You're thinking about the goal, and you're thinking about the present moment. And one manifestation of the self-effacing nature of pilgrimage is the fact that the beauty we marveled at was entirely other-focused. We appreciated what was in front of us, and two memories come to mind. I remember my dad, he was looking out over the cliffs into this beautiful turquoise water, and he was staring at this sight in front of him, and he said, "I just need to stand here and soak this in. And then he said, I wish I could open my eyes wider. Like I wish that I could open them wider to see this better and take all of this in. And that desire he expressed reflects so well this idea of appreciating what is outside of yourself. Another time we were walking on this unexpected stretch of path, and the photo on the right does not do it justice, but it was this lovely glen with a clear running stream, and the trees on either side formed this lush canopy over us. The air was illuminated by a soft golden light, and I was just utterly enchanted by this place. And my dad and I kept saying to each other, is this real? And then I remember saying, I don't want this path to end, right? And that desire, the desire to remain in beauty, is, I think, looking back on it now, the same one that Peter, James, and John experienced at the Transfiguration when they asked if they could pitch tents and stay the night. It's a desire to revel in otherworldly beauty. These examples show that pilgrimage, insofar as it allows you to interact with nature in this self-effacing way, reteaches you that beauty is fundamentally something appreciated in another. So the second way that pilgrimage reoriented me toward beauty was by increasing my sensitivity to beautiful things. And what I'm going to share is kind of mysterious, but and I'd be interested to know if other pilgrims experience this, but what I experienced is that over time, the simplest things became beautiful. And you can see this in the progression of photos I took on the pilgrimage. So I began by taking these fantastic shots of the landscape, which are very clearly worth taking and worth having. But then I started to sort of take photos of more mundane things over time, right? So here you have a field of cattle and a field of corn. And then I started to become really interested in trees. And another favorite of mine to capture was flowers. And then it started to kind of get a little bit ridiculous. Like here I am taking photos of blackberries and roosters and this old man throwing pottery at Tintagel. But I think this is really beautiful. Pilgrimage gave me a time set apart for rediscovering the beauty of everyday life. And I think that that is also a rediscovery of a mode of worship, right? Our Sabbath is patterned after the day of rest that God took when he declared that creation was very good. To recognize the goodness and beauty in the world, even in the smallest parts of the world, is an act of worship, of resting in what is good. So to sum up, pilgrimage, because it put me in contact with what is really truly beautiful and gave me the time to relish it, was a balm for disordered sensibilities and insensitivity to the goodness of creation. Okay, the last aspect of pilgrimage I want to touch on is tradition, and tradition as an antidote to forgetfulness. And I actually mean a kind of Christian forgetfulness that I think we can be prone to. And there's two kinds of forgetfulness that I have in mind: forgetfulness of the ways God has worked in the world, and forgetfulness of the ways God is working in the world. My claim here is that pilgrimage reminded me of the history of God's saving work and its union with his ongoing saving work in the world. So I want to start by looking at that first kind of forgetfulness, historical forgetfulness. What drew me to the UK as a pilgrimage site in the first place is its deep and rich history of Christianity. This is something that, unfortunately, we do not have to the same extent in the US. Our Christian history is not nearly as ancient. So coming from this context, I was yearning to learn about who God is through seeing how he has acted in the world. And the Cornish Celtic Way, with its strong historical focus, was tailor-made for this purpose. But we also found ourselves naturally gravitating towards evidence of the continuity of Christianity in the land. So for example, we were especially impressed by sacramental objects, baptismal fonts, Celtic and lantern crosses, and even just the structures of churches, which bore witness of being rebuilt in stages over time. Pilgrimage, it put me in contact with the physical stuff, the physical tradition of historical Christianity, and it thereby mystically put me into contact with the Christians who worshiped at these churches, who were baptized at these fonts, and who touched their foreheads to these crosses. The work of God in the land through the liturgical witness of the people was undeniable on my pilgrimage. So, because on a daily basis, I underwent an act of remembrance of God's saving work, this also generated for me a duty and a desire to remember God at Christian sites that have fallen into disrepair or disuse. And on our pilgrimage, we took every opportunity to visit ruined or otherwise secularized chapels and overgrown or unknown holy wells. I have so many great stories of finding and visiting these forgotten places, but I want to share with you just one story that I think encapsulates this theme of forgetfulness and the duty to remember. And this story is about a well. It's about a well called St. Gundred's Well. But Cornwall is full of holy wells associated with pre-Christian practices and late antique and medieval saints. These wells are often located nearby where saints founded Christian communities. And each well, as we discovered, has its own fascinating history of miracles, healings, or baptisms. The story of St. Gundred's Well goes like this. At some point in the Middle Ages, there was a leper in Cornwall, and he was expelled from his village to live in solitude in a monastic cell. And actually, here's the cell, which I wouldn't mind living in. It's part of the astonishing St. Michael's Hermitage on Roach Rock, which we also visited. So this leper who was living here, he depended on his daughter Gundred to bring water to him from a well that was about 1.5 miles away. She did this every day for him. And because of her filial piety and her compassion, she was named a saint. We wanted to venerate Gundred by visiting her well. She was like this living example of those virtues of a dependence that I spoke of earlier. So we had some GPS coordinates for the well, and we were trying to get to them, but we couldn't really figure out how to make much progress because the closer we got to the GPS coordinates, we realized that there was this fence that blocked our path. And we also realized that the well was actually on private property. So we took a risk and hopped a gate to farmland property and knocked on the door of the farmhouse and asked for permission to visit the well. The lady of the house agreed. She said she would keep the dogs in while we went down, and she warned us that it was very slippery. So behind the farmer's house was this long, overgrown area, basically a ravine, and it was indeed very slippery. There was no proper path to the well, but as we walked, we knew we were going the right way because there was just this loud sound of the bubbling of the spring. As we got closer, the ground actually turned into a marsh. And finally, we found an old well house with a forceful flow of water. Here it is. And I was so impressed by the fact that this well had fallen into disuse, was overgrown and hardly visited, but was still so powerful that its water was bubbling up from the ground all around it. I think if her well is anything to go by, then Gundred is a formidable intercessor. So for our act of remembrance at this well, we participated in a holy well liturgy, which we created. We invoked God in our Cornish saints and the saint associated with the well, and we prayed a Celtic prayer called St. Bridget's Charm of Protection. That prayer has a line in it that I love that relates to wells. O God, an isle art thou in the sea, a hill art thou on the land, and a well art thou in the wilderness. And then we took a drink from the well and splashed the water on our hands and faces. This liturgy was an act of remembrance in the sense of bringing Gundred to mind, but also of reincorporating her into lived Christian practice today. And we did this ritual at every well we visited. Okay, so much for the first kind of forgetfulness, right? Forgetfulness of the ways God has worked. Now I want to talk about the second kind of forgetfulness, forgetfulness of the ways God is working in the world today. And my claim here is that pilgrimage reversed this forgetfulness through the ministry of hospitality that the churches along the Cornish Celtic Way participated in. Right? Showing hospitality to pilgrims is a long-standing tradition in the church, and we witnessed its continuation in the present day. We were given warm, kind welcomes from church wardens who saw to our physical, emotional, and spiritual needs. They offered us tea and biscuits, gave us a place to rest and sleep overnight, chatted with us about our journey and about their church, and prayed with us. Just as the physical remains of Christianity reminded me of the continuity of God's work in the past, so the actual people of the church communities reminded me of God's work in the world today and engendered a duty of gratitude. So I want to share just one interpersonal encounter that has stayed with me. There's so many that I could choose to share with you, but I'll just share one. And I don't actually have a photo of this moment because it was so ephemeral. And I think there's something beautiful about that, the fact that it was so ephemeral. But I do have a photo of where this encounter took place, which is a little cafe in St. Mawgan. So in St. Mawgan, we met a lovely and kind church warden named Jackie, who gave us a tour of her church. She encouraged us to visit the Carmelite monastery next door, and she gave us a safe space to sleep that night, with a cautionary warning to watch out for bats in the organ. The next day, after we had attended Mass at the monastery and ate breakfast at the cafe, we ran into Jackie again, along with her, a vicar friend of hers. And this vicar gave us the most exquisite and special pilgrim's blessing of our entire trip. So the thing is that I don't remember the exact words he used, but I can recall in kind of broad strokes that he prayed the skies would open up in blessings for us and that God would cradle us in the palm of his hand for our journey. And I remember that the five of us were united together outside of this cafe, on the doorstep of this cafe, like united together in total trust of God. This blessing was so special to us that we returned to the cafe a little while later to give Jackie and the vicar a small gift of thanks. And what I found interesting and touching about that return is that when we returned to the cafe and explained how much the blessing meant to us, they said the same thing, right? They also said that it was just this singular moment that caught them by surprise as much as it did us. And actually recalling that moment, I'm kind of getting shivers. That blessing, I think, was so extraordinary that I still feel it resting on me. I think, again, this has to be the work of the Holy Spirit. Okay, so to sum up my thoughts on tradition, on pilgrimage, I encountered the historical tradition of Christianity through physical sites of worship and the living tradition of the church, through the hospitable people I met along the way. The union between the historical tradition and the living tradition helped me to realize God's saving work continues throughout all of time. So I'd like to finish my presentation today by sharing some thoughts on how to inspire more people to undertake walking pilgrimages. And looking back on what encouraged me to walk, I have, I think, 4 recommendations to offer you. The first is just share your story and be a resource to others. So if you've been on a pilgrimage, don't be afraid to share your story. Some people don't realize walking a pilgrimage is something that they can do and something that they can incorporate into their faith life. It's a very common occurrence for me to tell someone I've been on a pilgrimage and for them to just give me a blank look because they don't even know what that means. So I've tried to do this for you today, but I also very much applaud Phil for putting on this conference to do this very thing. And I hope that you all will find great conversation partners about pilgrimage today. The second and third thoughts I have are especially geared toward the young, and those thoughts are to emphasize adventure and beauty as pillars of pilgrimage. I think that these are two really exciting parts of life and of faith that everyone longs for, but especially the young at heart who are seeking to define themselves through having their own independent experiences of the world. Pilgrimage can give that to them in a healthy way. The last point, I think it's kind of a cheeky one, that pilgrimage does its own convincing, right? Just get somebody out there on the trail by whatever means. And it's my experience, and I think my family's experience, that if you get somebody out there, they will discover the value of it for themselves and keep returning to it. And just as a point of evidence, my family is going back to the UK for another pilgrimage in August this year. So with those 4 points in mind, I'd just like to thank you for allowing me to offer these reflections on pilgrimage, on walking on beauty, and on tradition. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you so much, Juliana, for that. That was absolutely wonderful. I can see from the reactions around the table that everyone was really touched by that. You spoke really deeply and really movingly. And I think you made us feel that it's all our responsibility somehow to spread this wonderful practice and to be involved in the re-enchantment of our land. So thank you very much. And we will be breaking for lunch online and on site here. I look forward to seeing you again afterwards. Thank you very much for taking part.